May I welcome you. I'm Armand Dangor, the tutor in classics at Jesus College, where my predecessor, Don Fowler, was fellow and tutor before, and after whom this lecture series, as many of you will know, is in honour. And today, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, David Butterfield, who many of you will know. David was at Cambridge for 20 years, man and boy, became a fellow in 2008, and he resigned from it in 23, and has now become the Provost of Ralston College in America, where he is about to fly tomorrow. I should just say that he is one of the most extraordinarily talented classicists in the world. He's a brilliant Latinist, and he has written on Lucretius, which of course was close to Don's heart. But he's also a paleographer, codicologist, and I had the opportunity of teaching at Ralston a couple of years ago in Italy, and I witnessed David's wonderful teaching abilities as well. So he's an all-round classicist. And today, I'm pleased to say he's going to be talking to us about Lucretius, to the title Lucretius' Lost Lives. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Armand, for an extremely generous introduction, and indeed thank you to all of you for finding time at such a busy period of term. I know there are so many things going on in the world, and that you've made time on an otherwise sunny afternoon. To come and talk about this man and these lost lives is really a generous gesture. It's an honour to me, genuinely, to be here and giving a Fowler lecture. I didn't have the pleasure of knowing Don Fowler. In fact, by the time of his tragically early death in 1999, I was a schoolboy, only a couple of years into learning Latin. But despite the fact I couldn't meet Don, he actually has been in my life in one way or another for really the last 25 years. In the year 2002, he published his doctoral thesis. It was posthumously published, of course, which was on the first quarter of Book 2. And not only is Book 2 easily the most complex and difficult of Lucretius's work, but that single commentary, even though it's only on 300 or so lines, is the model of how a Lucretian commentary should be. In terms of its range of skills, the depth of its insight, and the brilliance of its author's facility in Latin, it is unsurpassed, which for an author who's been heavily commented on for 500 years is a great achievement. And that book, appearing in 2002, appeared in the first year I met Lucretius myself as an A-level text. And it was the first big boys book that I bought when I became a scholar rather than a mere schoolboy in the world of Latin. So, to be here and to have been invited to speak about Lucretius is a joy. I'm hoping, and it is of course just a hope, that you will be able to read the text and see the images that will appear throughout what I have to say. If it is more convenient for you, you can pull up a PDF of this on your phone, if it's easier to read. If you want to do that, either QR code that with your scanner thing, or go to this address, antiquajournal.com TLC, it'll appear as a PDF. Maybe none of you need to do that. If so, that is great. So, Lucretius's Lost Life, a deliberately ambiguous title, not just to bring you in, but also because there are many ways I want to approach Lucretius. What I can't do in a lecture like this is set before you this great poem in 6 books with 7,500 lines and attempt to distill it and to decoct it into something original and true. So instead, I'm going to approach Lucretius's poem from different angles, even though we will find that the poem itself is our best guide to say anything meaningful. So in the time ahead, I would like to approach those 3 words, Lucretius's lost life, in 3 completely different ways. The first is, I mean the lost life of Lucretius. Clearly he lived, and clearly he wrote, but we are incredibly ignorant in terms of what he actually did in that life. It's a remarkable gap in the record. So what can we say of this largely lost life of Lucretius? That's the first aspect. Second, there is, or is there, a lost life of Lucretius, a Vita Lucretii, written about the man in the ancient biographical tradition. Unfortunately, you won't find it on the shelf because it's lost. But what can we say about it, if indeed it existed? And finally, this is the most profound and, for me, the most difficult of the three, but it's the one that we're really building to, the one that matters most. The lost life of Lucretius. Was Lucretius' life, in some way, lost to the project, lost to this ambition to write a 6-book, didactic, epic poem to convert the reader to the philosophy of Epicureanism? Was it a life well spent, a life won, as opposed to a life lost? So that's the structure of what I'll be taking you through today. So if we cast our mind around the ancient Roman world, we are surrounded by almost unimaginable luxury for the ancient historian. The literary record, the epigraphic record, that is to say what is inscribed on stone and therefore can't change, the archaeological record, and indeed the broader cultural inheritance of the ancient Roman world, especially in the 1st century BC, is immense. So if we're talking about the figure who wrote genuinely one of the most influential poems of the ancient world, and apparently did so largely in Rome, we should expect a surfeit of riches to tell us more about this Lucretian figure. We know lots about Virgil, we know a fair amount about Catullus, and really any other poet you can think of the name of. So long as his work survives, we are able to say some things that are factually true. Imagine spending 50 years of your life, half a century, working almost exclusively on Lucretius, publishing the great commentary to date in 3 volumes in 1947, and writing 1,750 pages of dense type about Lucretius. And that is your opening sentence when this gigantische Lebenswerk on which you've devoted your whole life appears. Cyril Bailey, a man of Balliol, as Don Fowler was for a while. The life and personality of Lucretius remain a mystery. Now that's the life and personality, which, in other words, is almost anything you would want to know about the man. Ronald Syme, one of the great Roman historians, of his, that is Lucretius' origin, nothing's known. And Martin Ferguson Smith, who in the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st has also spent at least half a century working primarily on Lucretius. Of all the great Latin writers, he says, we know least about TLC. So there really are only 3 certain facts. These are they. This Lucretius figure was doing his thing in the first half of the 1st century BC. Maybe he lived beyond that. No evidence that he did, but he was certainly doing something then. What was his thing? Well, it was writing this great poem, De Rerum Natura, which genuinely, to my mind, is one of the most powerful works of literature, however you want to take that phrase, ever written. It's a remarkable poem. Its title is awkward to translate. It's often on the nature of things, which is what literally the Latin means. But what does that mean? Look up natura, and you'll find its range of meaning is immense. And res, rerum here in the genitive, is just anything that exists. So I tend to prefer either on everything or even on reality. Lucretius believes that this poem will describe everything that meaningfully exists. And what isn't in there are the consequences and the inferences you are to draw from what it contains. So he certainly wrote that. We have that in 6 books. And finally, it's manifest from the text that it's dedicated to an addressee called Memmius. He pops up in books 1, 2, and 5 of the 6. About a dozen instances, undeniably there. Those are the facts. It takes 850 years in the evidential record for this famous poet to allow us to know his cognomen, his nickname, the name that comes after his family name, Lucretius. Carus, dear, beloved. That literally doesn't appear anywhere in the ancient literary sources. And we only get Titus at the start there, in Pliny the Elder. So beyond the name Lucretius, we struggle in the 500 years of the ancient record in Latin to see the man's name in full. Here is one of the most famous, or if you prefer, infamous pieces of evidence. And in fact, it's the first time, based upon what survives, where Lucretius is mentioned. And it is true to say that tens, probably hundreds of thousands of words have been written on this one or two sentences. What's going on? We're looking at a letter that was probably never intended to be published. It's a genuine private letter from the great orator Marcus Tullius Cicero, writing to his brother Quintus, who was many things in the world, just like Cicero, his brother, was. At the time, he was joining Caesar's army in Gaul as a legatus, so as an active figure in the military. And probably at this point, he's journeying somewhere in northern Italy into Gaul. At the start of the letter, it's clear this is one of these rapid-fire kinds of postal service documents. There's a special service that could happen whereby you receive codicilli and you are able to scratch out the letter you've received in the wax, immediately write a response, and then the tabularius, the postman who brought it, leaves with it. So it's an instant day response. Why is that relevant? It means this letter was both written rapidly and didn't really have a planned structure behind it. And at the very end, in what I regard as a postscript, because it doesn't tally with anything else, Cicero says to his brother, Lucreti poemata ut scribis et assunt, multis luminibus ingenii, multae tamen artis. That is to say, just as you've written in the letter I've just read, Quintus, Lucretius's poem, or the poetry of Lucretius, or the passages we've been looking at, are pretty much as you make of it. That means Quintus has sent to Cicero some or all of Lucretius's poem and has said it's got a lot of ingenium, flashes of ingenium. What is completely ambiguous and indeed insoluble is whether multae tamen artis is a further judgment of Quintus. It's got the ingenium, it's got the genius, but also this guy's taken care, he's taken time, he's worked on the craft, and therefore it's both inspiration and technical techner. The alternative, of course, is that Cicero is pointing out that there's actually quite a bit of techner alongside the ingenium that Quintus has praised. We don't know. Immediately the subject changes, but only to a degree. But when you've got here. There's no main verb. Most people take this, as I do, to mean we'll talk more about Lucretius when we're next together. That may be several months away, but it's evidence, if for nothing else, that Cicero would like to say more about this Lucretius figure. And then finally, if you've read Sallust's Empedoclea, well, I'll think you to be aware, a true upstanding gentleman, proper Roman, but I won't think you human. It's a joke, one assumes, so you're welcome to laugh if Cicero makes you laugh. The implication seems to be that you will indeed be doing your proper service, your genuine literary or intellectual work, if you can strap yourself in, for what I take to be a poem about Empedocles, the Greek philosopher, in Latin. But if you actually get through it, then you're clearly missing a screw, or something's not quite right with you. It's awful. So it seems as though the postscript is yoking together two little literary points that Cicero makes at the last moment. What's important for the broader argument, and as I say, many people over the last 200 years have written on this, is that if, certainly in early February 54, Lucretius is circulating, it means only one of two things. There's only two possibilities. Either Lucretius's poem is out there, because Lucretius is dead. And as a result of that, the poem is available. That's a very common event, indeed, most famously happened with Virgil's Aeneid. Or Lucretius is somehow in overlapping circles with at least Quintus Cicero, and he shared the poem before its completion and, obviously, his death. So it's doing the rounds. Yes, there's a third possibility that this is a different Lucretius or it's a different text, but almost no one in the world believes that, and I'm afraid we don't have time for that level of skepticism today, but it is theoretically possible. Another point which is often brought in is a couple of decades later, in 35 BC, Nepos, writing a life of really Cicero's best friend, Atticus, Pomponius Atticus, talks about a guy that no one's heard of, bizarre guy called Julius Calidus, Mr. July, hot Mr. July, and it is said he was effectively, in fact, easily, elegantissimus poeta of our age, post, that is to say, Lucretii Catulique mortem. After Lucretius and Catullus died, it's all about Calidus. Well, we're very confident, again, there's a tiny minority who dispute this, we're very confident that Catullus dies in 54. Does Lucretius die around the same time? Well, it would make sense, given that we're talking about their death point as a moment in time, or a rough period in time. And some people put weight, although I don't put great weight, on the fact that Lucretii precedes Catulli. Is it after Lucretius and then Catullus died? Well, if so, that would suggest that Lucretius is dead by 54, which would tie in with the idea that his work is available by early 54. But again, that's just conjecture. What about Lucretius himself? No one in his lifetime, if he dies in 54, mentions him. But he wrote 7,500 verses, and after the very famous poem in which he addresses Venus, as if as a deity who can help him, he makes this famous comment in a single sentence. Nam neque nos agra hoc patriae temporoni quo possumus ae quo animo, nec memmi clara propago talibus in rebus communi desse saluti. He's just asked Venus that Rome be at peace. Hasn't necessarily asked Venus to make Rome peaceful because it isn't peaceful. He just says, look, let's have everything at peace. Why? Because we cannot, possumus, we're not able, agere hoc, to do this thing right now when it's an unseasonable time for our state. And the famous family of Memmius, if that's the case, in such circumstances, he's not going to be able to desert the Commonwealth. He's going to have to get involved politically. Now, this sentence has been so often misunderstood that it is remarkable. What people take this to say is that we need peace to be delivered now, otherwise I cannot work. But as Katharina Volk saw in an article about 15 years ago, this is a statement of fact in the indicative. And it's simply true, Lucretius says, that he can't write an Epicurean poem if there's war, and more importantly, Memmius won't be able to read it and attend to it as his pupil if he's busy politically. We just can't do that. We then get the remainder of the poem written. So it follows that the circumstances flagged here obtain. And if you're wondering about the language, you might be thinking, maybe it's we can't act hoc temporoni quo patriae. We can't act in this, currently, unhappy time for the nation. Well, I'm afraid not. In book 4, Lucretius is talking about how people dream of what they spend their days doing, and we can all relate to that. He says, look, even me, when I fall asleep, I dream that I agere hoc, that I'm doing this, writing this actual poem, and seeking the nature of things at all times, and setting it forth, etc. So agere hoc in the poem is Lucretius' language for writing this. Tempora iniquo, as well as a phrase, only occurs once. Indeed, iniquum, the adjective, only occurs in the two instances you see here. And it's about something completely different, namely when atoms come together to create certain natural life. And it's clear at that point it means the inappropriate time. the unseasonable time, the unhelpful time. So it's not a strong phrase. It means if the circumstances aren't right, we can't do our thing. It therefore follows, I am afraid, that the most direct statement in this poem about contemporary politics in general cannot be pinned down to anything. And even if you thought it could, even if you thought this sentence has to mean, at the time of writing, there's major civil disturbance, it takes you nowhere, because there are critics who say, this is in the proem, at the start. That's what you write first, that's where you begin. But then there are also critics who say, well, clearly you're going to write as the capstone of your work, the proem at the end, where you've got your actual dedicatee, you know what the structure is, and therefore this is the last thing written. So given that there's no one who believes a poem of this scale didn't take many years to write, this tells us nothing about when it's written at all. What about Memmius? We're desperately clinging to any evidence we can find here. And I don't want to say anything about the so-called Venus problem. Why does an Epicurean, who doesn't believe that the gods can help us, begin his poem by asking the goddess Venus for help? That's the problem. There are answers, but they're not relevant for today. Instead, we have to look at what we're told about Memmius. Lucretius says, look, Venus, I need you to be my Socia, my ally, as I get on writing this, because I'm trying to set out these things for our Memmiadae nostro, for our descendant of the gens Memmia, of the Memmian family, someone whom you, Venus, have wanted to excel at all times, decorated in every possible way. So it's rather fawning praise of Memmius, but so fawning that it can't really amount to anything. Then Memmius himself is addressed later on in Book 1. Lucretius says it's your virtus, not really virtue, your being a proper Roman man, that keeps me pulling all-nighters, working through the tranquil nights on this work. And a phrase that has had a lot of ink spent and spilt on it. It's also your sperata voluptas suavis amicitiae. Suavis is probably in the genitive, so it's the hoped-for pleasure of sweet friendship with you. Well, that might just be about being friends, but many people have, I think, quite rightly read it as Epicurean philia, friendship where you gather in the garden, and therefore the conversion of Memmius as addressee into Epicureanism. If he did that and became a true Epicurean friend, the job would be well done. So that's really what Memmius can tell us in the poem, and that alone. We're not doing very well in reconstructing Lucretius, so let's have one further push on Memmius. Memmi Clara Propago, the famous family of Memmius. I think we can all agree that would be a ridiculous phase if something wasn't known of the gens Memmia. And it so happens we know a lot about that family. It was a plebeian family, so not from the great patrician nobility, but they were on the up, and although they hadn't had a consul by the time of the 1st century BC, God, they were trying, and the Memmius that most people associate with the poem was one person trying to climb that greasy pole. He is addressed pointedly by this archaic adjective, inclutus, rather strange word. Doesn't occur much in the poem, but note in its other two occurrences. It's used of Venus, she is an incluta dea, and the great Epicurus, the man behind the religion, or rather, I should say, the philosophy which Lucretius treats as a religion, that solves your life. He's also inclutus. So again, there's no way to avoid the conclusion that at least on papyrus, Lucretius wants to venerate the renown of Memmius. He's mentioned, as I say, rather patchily. For other reasons, critics believe that books 1 and 2 and 5 were written first. That's therefore led to an argument that in the 4 books he's not in, 3, 4, 6, for whatever reason, Memmius was out of favour. I incline to that, but again, it's not going to help us greatly. So, this is the most common figure. Son of Lucius Gaius Memmius. possibly roughly the same age as Lucretius, as we'll see in a moment. Got a tribunate in the late 60s, definitely praetor in 58, and then he comes into view in Bithynia in 57, because when he heads out there as governor, he brings Catullus with him, and Catullus writes 2 poems about him, which we'll see a little of in a moment. Then it comes to the crux. In the year 54, when you're campaigning for next year's offices, he pushes for consul. So in that same year that the Ciceros are talking about Lucretius, its probable addressee is starting to make manoeuvres for the consulship. It goes incredibly wrong. It's one of the great failures of Roman politics. And he ends up having to reveal that he tried to spend 4 million sesterces to bribe the magistrates to help him out. So he's charged with corruption. He's sent into exile, with Pompey being one of the main drivers. He goes to Greece, Athens in particular, and never comes back. It's possible there's a plan to get him back in the 40s, but he's definitely dead by 46 and probably dead by 49. He marries, and he marries in a way that makes him Sulla, the dictator Sulla's son-in-law. Marries Fausta Cornelia, but infidelity actually on both sides causes him to divorce, again, 55, around the time that Lucretius may be rounding off his poem. One of the other snapshots we get of Memmius is that he was a poet. And what Ovid decides to say about Memmius is that the Carmen Memmi, the poem, whatever it is, of Memmius, really gave names to things, i.e. it spoke in a very direct way about salacious material, called a spade when it came to the bedroom, and there was shamefulness in its use of languages. So it's some kind of erotic poetry which, as it were, doesn't pull the punches. That's all we know. This is a coin issued by the son of the Memmius in question. And I've given the reverse in just 2 angles here. But you see, Gaius Memmius, who chose to call himself Imperator, dictator, in a military sense, during his governorship, an unusual thing to do. But here we have the goddess trampling down some captive, marking the power of Memmius, so a man who likes to be known that he's in control. As I say, when he went to Bithynia, he had Catullus with him, and that is significant because Catullus was nothing other than a poet at this time. There are some business connections in the family to do with fish sauce, not interesting. What's relevant for us is that Catullus is happy to talk about his time in Bithynia, and he falls out with Memmius. He calls him an irromator praetor, which, unlike Memmius, I won't give a direct translation of, but let's just say, if you meet an irromator, you're going to know about it. Helvius Cinna. Cinna was another poet in the Neoteric line, this fashionable avant-garde movement in poetry. So, Memmius, himself an erotic poet, decides to bring 2 other fashionable poets with him as part of his entourage. So to me it's a fair question. Was Lucretius, who at that time was writing a poem dedicated to this Memmius, also part of the trip? There's one point in the poem where he talks about the flow of the Sea of the Pontus, which would be visible from northern Turkey, of course. I don't know, but it solves a problem which many critics, including the world expert in the room, have considered, which is, given that there is undeniably interaction between Catullus's longest poem, poem 64, and what is in Lucretius's poem, and given that it's hard to believe poem 64 of Catullus could be written after 54 BC, Catullus is dead, how does he know of Lucretius's poem? Or if you want to reverse it, which I really don't mind about, how does Lucretius know about Catullus's poetry such that he echoes it? Well, if either of these things is true, we have an answer. Either Lucretius went on this trip, maybe didn't enjoy it, not his kind of guys, but clearly they shared poetry and that was the form of influence. Or Memmius asked Lucretius if he could spare a draft of where the poem is, and the poem went out to Bithynia before publication, and Catullus learned it that way. Either way, it's a meaningful link. And those of you who've read the poem carefully will know that there's a remarkable passage of 60-odd lines where the Magna Mater, the mother goddess, Cybele, is described in really extremely vivid detail for no real point at all. Combine that with one of the strangest poems ever written in Latin, Catullus 63, which is all about Attis and his unfortunate interaction with the same Eastern goddess. And you've got two people writing about a Bithynian goddess at the same time for no apparent reason. He could have been there. Okay, Memmius is asked early on to focus. You've got to give me unpreoccupied ears, Lucretius asks, and if the supplement is correct, keen mind. You've got to leave your cares behind, because I don't want you rejecting my teachings before you've understood them. And this tone of constantly pushing Memmius on really works all the way through the poem as a whole, even if Memmius isn't mentioned that much. At another point, quite early on, Lucretius is direct. He says, look, I'm really worried that you, yes, you, tu, te, met, doubly marked emphatic form of you, yes, you, someday will, future indicative. You're going to try to disassociate yourself with what I'm teaching you here. Why? Because you'll be defeated by the terriloquis dictis of the Vartes. Those priests will get at you with their frightening words, and they'll invent things for you, and you're going to reject my Epicurean teachings. So it's framed as though Lucretius is genuinely worried that he might lose his pupil. Well, Cicero can perhaps help us there. In 46 BC, when, as I say, we know Memmius was dead, we get a little sketch from Cicero. And we're told that he was perfectus in his literaris Graecis, knew his Greek literature well, but really wasn't into Latin lit. He could speak well, charming mode of delivery, but he was not a worker. He shirked the labor, not only of speaking, but even thinking. Just couldn't really be bothered with it all, and effectively, in proportion to how little he did, his work suffered. So we're being told that the dedicatee of a Latin poem isn't really into Latin literature. Again, if this is after the fact, as it must be, perhaps the project of taking in Memmius as the pupil for the De Rerum Natura was not a success. The other item we have here, which I'll just summarise in brief, is that a remarkable piece of evidence appears in 51 BC, so a few years later. Cicero is writing a letter to the Memmius that we've been speaking about. And the letter, which is very carefully phrased, very respectful and tactful, is ultimately trying to guarantee that Memmius doesn't go ahead with his building plans. He wants to build something new on the ruins of Epicurus's house. The great majority of people in interpreting this letter have taken it to mean that, for whatever reason, Memmius had no desire to revere where Epicurus lived, and he's going to knock it down and do something else. 1% have taken a different tact, which is to say, actually, maybe he wanted to build a sort of special new Epicurean centre, and all it is that people are disagreeing about what to do. I don't find that probable, I'm afraid. Therefore, I think we are in a world where Cicero is saying to Memmius, look, we can laugh at what the head of the Epicurean school believes. It's possible for us to derideamus. We can literally laugh at it. It's not the kind of vita or ratio, life or system, anyone would follow in philosophy. But we don't hate the guy, so come on, maybe let's help him out even though he's a bit silly in his beliefs. It's genuinely anti-Epicurean in framing. So Memmius doesn't take us very far. We can say a fair bit about the man, but it's been something of a dead end to tell us more about Lucretius because his presence in the work is so mixed. What then can we say of Lucretius? Well, everyone's got a view. He's an aristocrat, he must be. 300 years before him, there was still a family around called the Lucretii Tricapitini. And yes, although they've all disappeared and none of them are around, he writes in a rather lordly way. So Lucretius is an aristocrat we otherwise don't know. No, he's an equestrian. He's of that lower social status as a knight, but, he's well respected. No, he's a plebeian. He's from the plebs, but he's a man who's got really into his philosophy, maybe as an autodidact, and he's on his way. No. He was a slave, and then he was freed, and he's come from some other part of the world, and he's a man on a mission trying to persuade what's happening, trying to persuade Rome to get with him. Where's he based? Well, he's Roman, he's talking about Romans, that would be natural. Almost everyone says that. No, he's from North Italy, from across the Po, and you can tell that because sometimes he's a bit like Catullus. No, he's from Naples, which is where I'm from, says Della Valle, and there were other Epicureans down there, so that seems a good bet. I think he's an Umbrian. Why? No evidence. I think he's a Sabine, says Syme. Why? Because he'd said Umbrian and that was already taken, so he just throws it in as another possibility. Or Marx returns again and says because you get certain words in Celtic languages beginning with car, which is true, but not interesting, he's a Celtiberian freedman. The fact is, none of this amounts to anything. And if you're going to go down the sad path of Gerlo, recently resurrected by Sant'Angelo, this is a fraud. It's a hoax. Atticus, the best friend of Cicero, has decided to amuse himself by writing a 6-book epic under the name Lucretius, which Cicero decides never to mention in his 16 books of letters to Atticus. So them's your options. On to section 2. I don't think, by the way, that we could say nothing, but that literally is the evidence. Okay, now, some of you may know that I haven't said anything of something rather important. Around the year 380 AD, so what? A bit more than 400 years after Lucretius, Jerome, Saint Jerome, translates into Latin Eusebius's huge chronicon, a sort of temporal encyclopedia, and in what may be the year 94, but it could be other years depending on different manuscripts, says this: Titus Lucretius, the poet, is born in that year, who later was driven mad by an amatorium porculum, by a love potion, having written some books in the lulls of his madness, of his insanity, which afterwards Cicero amended, and then he killed himself by his own hand in his 44th year of life. That is certainly what that Latin says. Let's add in one more thing. In the life of Virgil, a poet with almost infinitely richer biographical history, we're told in a section of Donatus's life, written in the mid-4th century as well, that in his 17th year, which would mean 53 BC, during the consulship of Pompey and Crassus, which would be 55 BC, sorry about that, it so happened that on his birthday, Lucretius died that day, on the 15th of October, which I think also marks Don Fowler's passing, which is a remarkable coincidence too. So although we have two different days and dates, this is pointing either to a death in 55 or 53, possibly on this rather convenient 15th of October date. Well, I'm afraid the numbers don't work and the problems are bigger than that. We've got Jerome, we've got Donatus. Do they have a common source? It's everyone's go-to man, Suetonius, who did write a De Poetis, a work on poets, which of course is lost. But was there in that a life of Lucretius which fed into Jerome and Donatus? Maybe, maybe not. I'll come back to why very briefly in a moment. How did Suetonius, writing in the mid-2nd century AD, know anything about Lucretius? Well, one of the great grammarians, Probus, appears to have edited Lucretius in the 1st or early 2nd century AD. So there was a technical edition of Lucretius circulating. Varro, the great scholar of the 1st century BC, wrote a De Poetis, but he seems to have avoided mentioning anyone contemporaneous to him, so he is no help. Were there others? Well, theoretically, Probus must have drawn on material, but we have no evidence of any other work on Lucretius, other than Jerome saying that when he was a boy, he read commentaries on the poem. That's it. So we don't know whether Suetonius wrote a life of Lucretius. But many assume that he did not. Because if he said the things we find in Jerome, it is unbelievable that the church fathers, those early Christians who attack Lucretius a lot, would say nothing of his madness, nothing of his suicide, nothing of his strange involvement in love potions. They have no story to tell. And so although that's an argument from silence, I fully appreciate, there isn't material made of what they would find in Suetonius had they had him. Then there's this thing called the Borgia Life, which is just an insane compilation written in around the year 1500, discovered in the late 19th century, and everyone was so excited because it's sort of like Jerome's account on acid in terms of what it says about Lucretius, but it's a humanistic fabrication. It gives us nothing. So we're back with Jerome and Donatus with their inconclusive evidence. Lucretius born in 99 or 98 or 97 or 96 or 95 or 95 or 94 BC, those are the possibilities, and he died in 55, 51, 51 or 50. That will be true, but we can't say more than that. My own little theory, which is that there is some truth to Jerome's dating of the 44th year. You can make the numbers work if 39, which was written like that in antiquity, not IX, somehow had corruption of that to that. I know it seems fanciful, but if 44 is a corruption of 39, 94 and 55 make sense with the other evidence, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. And the older I've got, the more I realise that some of these particulars are trivial. They are mere trivia. But if he died before his 40th birthday, that is striking and worth bearing in mind. One thing on madness, in brief. Bailey, who, as I said, spent almost all of his life on Lucretius, gets to a point in his commentary towards the end of the longest book in Latin literature, which is book 5 of the poem, and he says, okay, maybe he was a bit mad. And this is about this famous passage, which we can't get into the details of, I'm afraid, but Lucretius has just set out that in the days when warfare was evolving, one of the things early people tried out was using different wild animals, and it was absolute carnage because they killed everyone. Okay. After that account, you get this strange to and fro in the voice of Lucretius. Well, if it was like what I just said, I can't really believe they wouldn't have known that would be a disaster. Maybe it happened in one of the other worlds, because there are infinite worlds in our universe. Actually, no, maybe they did do it because they just didn't have any other solution. Well, it's not a stable mind or a stable process of thought, and that convinced not just Postgate and Bailey, but Haussmann, in what I actually regard as his biggest moment of madness as a Latin critic. He buys into the fact that this is too weird to be Lucretius, and he says Cicero must have not just edited the poem, but written these 3 lines. Can't believe it. These 3 lines, maybe it's true. The middle 3 lines were written by some other interpolator. Crazy. It's a 3-page piece by Haussmann, and I find it jaw-dropping that he came round to that. So, was Lucretius mad in any way? Is there any reason to say? I'm of the persuasion that it was very convenient for the Christians to see him as a supposedly mad figure. Someone who teaches that the gods have no providence or care about humans, and that humans are not divinely created, but just a randomly successful gathering of atoms. They would want to put such a man down. And it's possible that a line such as ad deferor manimi proprium, where Lucretius says, add in the fact that there's this madness which is somehow inherent to the spirit, you could take proprium as meum in Latin and say, also remember my own mental madness. That's been used against him, possibly. Statius, writing more than a century later, speaks of the arduus furor docti Lucretii, the lofty, the sublime madness or mania, which of course is a common way of speaking about poets, of learned Lucretius, and maybe that was taken in a deliberately negative way. Or Lactantius, one of the earliest church fathers we have, says everything that Lucretius dare leer at, raves on about, comes from Epicurus. So verbs like this, of believing mad things, could have been deliberately taken to mean madness. And as for the love potion, it's true that book 4 is pretty full on, when it comes to both the dangers of lust and the various positions, physical or metaphysical, that love might put you in. Was that read as Lucretius bursting at the seams with his own mad love potions? More interestingly, in 54, which may be that same year in which Lucretius died, not a Lucretius but a Lucullus died from such a potion. He died from an amartorio. So is there a willful confusion or accidental confusion between this Lucullus and Lucretius? We don't know. A really important piece of evidence for me comes in Virgil. Virgil's early poetic career is deeply influenced by Epicureanism, and it's explicitly, or rather, I should say, clearly implicitly, influenced by Lucretius. And this is his famous Macarismos, his famous blessing, which honours Lucretius's legacy. Felix qui potuit rerum cognoscere causas, aquam etus omnis et inexorabila fatum subjecit pedibus, strepitum jacarontis avari. This is the language, as you can see, of Lucretius's poem. And it's celebrating as blessed, as happy, someone who was able to take on these philosophical ideals. It's not conceivable to me and to other critics that one would use this language of someone who committed suicide in madness as the world fell apart around him. It would seem cruel and callous to speak of such a man as Felix. Cicero's editor, when I was a younger man, I thought this was a mad idea and a wrong inference from the fact, as we saw at the start, that Cicero is the first mention of Lucretius. I'm now more open to it, but I'll tell you what I mean briefly. Pliny the Younger, in one of his letters, says that his correspondent has said Cicero was an exemplum. He was the model kind of character who might tell you whether something's worth publishing. And he, with mira benignitate, with remarkable kindness, forvisse ingenia poetarum, fostered the talents of poets. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence of that, but here we are, having Romans who had way more than we do, saying he did a lot for poetry, maybe behind the scenes. Second thing to bear in mind, at the time we're talking about, late 55, early 54, Atticus is in Rome with Cicero. So it's true they're not talking about Lucretius's poem beyond that one instance, but they wouldn't because they saw each other almost every day. There's no letters to be writing about the poem being published. And if there were a situation where the death of Lucretius, perhaps, meant that his Epicurean project was maybe not going to see the light of day, and Atticus, who himself was an Epicurean and a publisher, said maybe we should get that poem out, it seems to me perfectly possible that Quintus and Marcus would have taken a look at it, and it would have somehow entered circulation by early 54. I now see that although Cicero doesn't like Epicureanism, it's not, to me, a ridiculous hypothesis. Many people say, well, hang on a minute. The last 10 years of Cicero's life is dedicated in a very intense way to writing his own philosophical Latin accounts. And there's a huge amount in that of Epicureanism. Why do we not only find no mention of Lucretius, but we find really no echo of Lucretius? He's just not there. Is there a conspiracy of silence, many have said? Well, I think in a sense, yes, but I wouldn't use the language that strongly. There is no reason why Cicero would want to cite a poem, and there's no reason in particular why he would want to cite a good poem. And by that I don't just mean artistically a good poem. I mean a poem that very cogently makes the case for Epicureanism. If Epicureanism is true, Cicero's life has been wasted. His great achievement of becoming consul, of reaching the top of the greasy pole of Roman honours, means nothing. And almost everything he's dedicated his life to in the service of the state is as dust to the Epicurean. So his personal animus towards it is significant, and he's under no real obligation as a scholar to cite Lucretius, so I don't think it's a meaningful argumentum excellentio as to why he's not there. So I say, maybe. Maybe. Peter Green, said that Lucretius's work caused big problems, and it was without a doubt its appearance that first turned official opinion against Epicureanism in Rome. It's irresponsible, encourages civic indifference, a lack of moral conscience, and throws out tradition. All of that is true, and I think it therefore remains true that for a figure such as Cicero, Lucretius's poem is really not to his taste. It's not helpful to boost it. Final thing I'll say on this is that around this time, we don't know whether it's before or after, but in the mid-1st century BC, Epicureanism goes massive. But it's figures that we otherwise know nothing about writing scrappy Latin pamphlets who win over the people. And as you can see here, Cicero is saying in his Tusculan Disputations that the Epicureans were able to take over the world. I can't quite see the phrase. Yes, Italiam tortum occupaverunt. They conquered the whole of Italy in recent years. Amaphinius, Catius, and Rabirius. We don't have the text of these people, but even Cassius, that's the assassinator of Caesar, after his conversion to Epicureanism, says, okay, those guys, all of that kind of group, they're not good translators of Epicurus. They're low budget. Varro, the great scholar, when words are put in his mouth by Cicero in the Academica, also says that these guys write in a way that has no technical chops to it. It's just not good stuff. I mention that only as background noise to Lucretius's work. Even though we learn very little about his own fate, the people are getting behind Epicureanism. So I come to the final part of my lecture now. On Lucretius's lost life, I don't think there ever was one, that is to say, a Vita Lucretii, but I think plenty of work was done on him in the margins. Bignoni is exactly right when he said in 1945 that if you want to find the biography of Lucretius, you've got to turn to his actual poem. But there are problems. Peter Wiseman, who I love, but he's always got an interesting idea, says the only way we can get anywhere with Lucretius is to look at the poem, but there's plenty of stuff in there. Now, that takes him down a pretty unusual avenue, which I can't go into now, but he says, you've got stuff there. Sykes-Davies, however, says, yes, if you take all of the great poets of Europe, Lucretius has not only read the least, but he's read the worst. The readers of Lucretius are bad. Here's Coleridge writing to Wordsworth. Whatever in Lucretius is poetry is not philosophical. Whatever is philosophical is not poetry. These two things don't mix properly. It's a failed venture. Here's some of Macaulay's Marginalia from the 1830s. Very entertaining in their own way. But Lucretius does not have always forgiving and attentive readers. And Byron himself said, look, if you could just get the Epicureanism out of this poem, we'd be left with the greatest poem ever written. So, by that standard, Lucretius's work has been deemed something a failure. But the two things I'd like to sort of put some emphasis on before coming to a close are the apparent difficulty we face when in looking at Lucretius's poem and seeing that he really cares about the renown and the fame that the poem will bring him. It's explicit. So here in perhaps the most famous passage of the whole work, which occurs both towards the end of Book 1 and at the start of Book 4, we hear that laudi spes magna, great hope of praise, has struck my heart and has basically got me writing this poem. I really like approaching integros fontis, springs that are untapped, and plucking novos flores, new flowers. Why? So that I can have an insignis corona, an illustrious crown, from a place that the muses have never awarded a crown. And then we get two reasons at the bottom. Primum quod, dende quod. Why do I want to do this? Firstly, because I'm writing about something so important, because it's going to free you from the superstition of religion. But secondly, I'm doing it because I'm thrilled at the idea I can bring light and charm to this topic in poetry. So there's a twin aim, converting the reader and producing something beautiful in poetry. Later on, he celebrates that in the evolution of literature, not only is Epicureanism a recent invention, it's been discovered, this truth, but I, Lucretius, am the first guy who's turned it into Latin. I'm primus cum primis. By the way, no one knows what that Latin means. Some people think it means really the very first, primus cum primis. Others think it means first among the first, that is to say, yeah, there's other guys, and I grant some of them got there first, but I'm first among first. Don't know. I also think Repertus is odd, but that's for another time. And then in book 6, the last book, when he says, I'm reaching the final furlong, as it were, Calliope, help me out, he repeats again that he really wants a coronam insigni cum laude, a crown which is illustrious for its praise. So how does this square with an Epicurean who shouldn't be motivated by personal fame? Here he's acknowledging that the work is difficult for people who don't know about it, which is why it's in poetry. And there he says to Memmius, you might be backing off, so that's just evidence, I should say, that he knows his poem isn't easy. So is this ambition noble? Well, elsewhere he ridicules people who say things philosophically which they know aren't true. And they boast about such things, laudis causa, for the sake of their own fame. So he knows that people spewing philosophy for the sake of it is a bad way to go. Soon after, he says there's people who'll waste their whole lives statuarum ergo, for the sake of a statue, and of their nomen, so that their name is recognised. What a waste of time. And then finally, when addressing Epicurus in book 3, he says, look, I really am treading in your exact footsteps here, albeit in Latin, not Greek, but I'm not doing that because I'm cupidus certandi, keen to be your rival. I'm doing it out of love. I love you because I want to imitate you. To close, I want to say that the praise that Lucretius seeks and the success of the poem are united in a particular way. Wiseman tells us that the poem will reveal the real Lucretius. Well, I've looked and I've looked and I've looked, and there are only certain passages where I feel there's a slight lifting of the veil. And one is at the very close of book 4, that big attack on love and lust. And he's just talked about some pretty wild sexual positions. And he says, of course, our wives don't need that. Conjugibus nostris, why has he got our wives? Again, it's only a little point, but that has been assumed that he's married. Well, if he is, so what? More interesting is the text that follows. And he says, yeah, you should bear in mind that love doesn't come about by the gods or by the arrows of Venus, like the poets say. No, it's drip, drip, drip. It's through attritional processes that consuetudo. Familiarity breeds not contempt, but love. And just as water, drip, drip, drip on a rock, eventually gets through it, so too can even an ugly little woman come to be loved. A bizarre thing to say. But if it follows a mention of his own wife, maybe there is some background there. Again, I think he lets his guard down for whatever reason. The other thing to say is that there are moments in the poem, unquestionably, where Lucretius's pessimism or realism breaks through. This is one of the most famous passages in Latin literature. I regret that because of time I can only show you it. But it's these remarkable lines where he, for no real reason other than saying that the world is not perfect, reflects upon the wailing that a newborn child fills the world with on his or her appearance. And he says at the end, again, a slipping of the mask perhaps, ut aequumst, qui tantum invita restet transire malorum. And fair enough that it does, given the sheer amount of evils that await for it to pass through in life. At the bottom there, famous lines about the deluded minds and hearts of men and women who have not seen the Epicurean truth. Now, those of you who studied Lucretius will have heard of this age-old theory of anti-Lucrece chez Lucrece, the Lucretius trying to attack Lucretius within the poem. As Ted Kenny said 50 years ago, This is a dog which ought to be dead, but somehow refuses to lie down. The reason the dog won't die is because there are these changes of colour and of light in the poem. So, you can get people say things like, the failure of Lucretius. The poem is a failure. Why? Well, we know so little about Lucretius, perhaps. No one talks about Lucretius as a philosopher, perhaps. Memmius disappears, perhaps. Memmius doesn't become an Epicurean, perhaps. Well, I think that's wrong-headed, and as really one of the most terrifyingly learned men of our age would say, if one moral can be drawn from the failure of Lucretian biography, it's that the fewer the facts, the easier they are to fit into a pattern. People have created Lucretiuses which they want or need to exist, but simply don't. So the final point I want to put to you before we have some time for questions is that it is a success of the poem that I have struggled so much to say to you things about Lucretius. It is an Epicurean adage, a very famous phrase, lathe biosas, live unnoticed. Yes, you've got to live, but don't be out there. And I think the poem operates on a similar version, lathe poiesas, that is to say, write it, compose it, but go unnoticed. And although the poem seeks praise, it seeks that praise from the reader who begins and ends the poem. And the praise will be, my life has been changed through conversion to Epicureanism, and it is this poem that did it. Lucretius himself is able both to transcend the text, the poem transcends him, and it hides him. Lucretius is hard to find because he is not sought to be found. I cannot think of a poem that is as intense in its passion, in its fervour, in its mission and zeal to convert, which reveals so little of its author. The praise, as I say, comes from someone who will get to its end. And although Lucretius, as Don Fowler says a lot in his commentary, is someone so drawn to vivid detail, who uses verbs of seeing all the time, only twice does he meaningfully use the verb of himself. So someone who sees the word visually only twice moves away from we humans see to I have seen. And once it's about echoes in the mountains, he's heard an echo up to 7 times in the hills, and another time it's about a magnet. He deliberately hides himself by the broader empirical data that humans enjoy. So yes, you could write a kind of dating profile and say, yeah, Lucretius, he likes nature, children, hounds if they're the right kind, lambs drunk on milk, horses, mountains, and Athens. Did he go to Athens? I think so, but we don't know. Did he go there en route to Bithynia? Maybe. Hates, yes, doesn't like non-Epicureans except those 2 guys. Doesn't like the sea, or people keen on politics, or the loudmouth religious types, or empty luxuries, or envy. Or worst of all, someone who doesn't read with care. You can get those hints from the poem, but again, I see these as trivia that Lucretius would not want us to put weight behind. So for my final slide, I give the lines which I think mean the most to him. I think Virgil was inspired by Lucretius to combine a poem that seeks to embed him in the history of Latin literature through addressing a great patron, or friend, as Memmius may have been, but retiring from the urban hubbub. He was a man whose true passion lay in the natural world, and these lines are repeated twice in the poem. They were probably first written in Book 5, that great account of the history of humankind, and he's talking about the birth of music. And in pretty much the happiest lines in the poem, he fantasizes about how wonderful it must have been for primitive shepherds to be gathered, playing music and singing, sprawled out on the grass, not needing wealth, the sun shining, and then they're just enjoying a locus amoenus, a beautiful spot. Well, he then repeats those lines in Book 2. Obviously, it occurs earlier, but who knows when it was written. And he uses that as the archetypal summary of what the good life looks like. It's explicitly non-urban, it's explicitly non-luxurious, and it needs nothing other than true friends. And as Don Fowler says on this point in his commentary, the simple life so described can provide deliciae with a delicious description of the possible delights. Lucretius is not claiming that all men live such a life, merely that nature does not lack sensual pleasure if men do pass their days in this manner. So whether he's a fanatic who devoted his life to a man he treated as if a god, all of these are made-up images, by the way. We have no likeness of the man. Whether he's a disciple of Epicurus who can never be known. This, by the way, was a ring discovered in the 19th century, Lucre, bought by the man of letters Andrew Lang, who boasts that he's got it in the 1880s, now disappeared. Probably it was a forgery sold to the Brits. It's on the front cover of Munro's edition, but pretty weird. And this is based upon the same idea. So, to close, Ovid, who is not a man naturally drawn to Epicureanism, says in two oft-repeated but beautiful lines, Carmina sublimis tunc sunt peritura Lucreti, exitior terras cum dabet una dies. The poem of sublime Lucretius will indeed perish, but only when that one day will consign the world to destruction. So here we are, more than 2,000 years down the line, honouring a man who spent so much of his life devoted to Lucretius, to talk about the poem. And I hope, although I haven't got so far in several directions, there's ample material here for us to talk about in questions now. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, David, for an extraordinary performance. I think we can all agree from that what a wonderful tribute it is to Don. What an amazing piece of scholarship you have presented us with, and how we feel that I think you have managed to make it accessible to everyone at every level, and we're very grateful to you for that. I think because of your extraordinary ability to control the room, I will leave you to arrange for questions and answers, if I may do that.
Okay, of course. Well, please either ask about something I said, something I didn't say which you think I should have said. I'll be delighted to hear from any of you as you like. I see Stephen at the back. Okay, let's begin there.
The Brutus passage.
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to ask about.
Okay.
And so you were rather arguing that this suggests Memmius wasn't interested in Latin poetry.
Fastidiosus sane Latinarum.
And obviously you also adduced evidence that he is very engaged with Latin poets, and presumably therefore with Latin poetry. So I wonder whether you were perhaps not treating that bit of phrasing as carefully as you might have done.
That's very fair, thank you. So we're faced with the facts here. Brutus, which is addressed to, again, the Brutus who slew Caesar, albeit not yet in 46 BC, is a work about oratory, about the way to approach speech, and Memmius has a sketch within that, as I said. Clearly there is an opposition between his level of engagement being perfectus in Greek literature, and then we've got to contrast that with fastidiosus, which I take to mean not really having the appetite and interest in, by comparison. Now it is true, I've indeed advanced it as an argument of my own, that Memmius was both a poet and into what you and I will know as the neoteric, the new movement of the Novi Poetae, the new poets. I think it is still coherent that whatever happens with the remaining years of Memmius's life, Lucretius regards that exceptionally Hellenized form of Latin poetry as showing a disdain for the long arc of the Latin literary tradition, and therefore there are a lot of literae Latinae, which perhaps Memmius explicitly said he was not keen on, despite favouring the likes of Cinna and Catullus and co. It's not the place where Cicero would have glossed and clarified that distinction anymore, but I suppose the difficult aspect for me is, given Cicero certainly knew that the De Rerum Natura was addressed to Memmius, and very probably that's this Memmius, what would we make of this claim in that context? And if it's true that something happened, either personally between Lucretius and Memmius, or in Memmius' own very checkered political career in the mid-50s, that Memmius just became manifestly inappropriate for the poem, or asked for his name no longer to be used, these are not mad ideas, then this would make his rejection of that important work of Latin literature even more striking. So I welcome your push for nuance, but I think it can still be read as a broad antipathy to the Latin literary tradition.
I suppose I was thinking that you could perhaps say the same thing of Catullus.
You could. Certainly if the similarities between Cicero and Lucretius are not to be traced to some notional lost archaic source, then yes, that would be fair to say. Dan?
Thanks, David. I think that was great. And just following from Steve's point about Memmius, I think we also have evidence, which I don't think you mentioned, that Memmius is a bad poet. So we've got this anecdote in Gellius in his Attic Nights, book 19, chapter 9, I think. And he's talking about a birthday party that he was at, where there was a crowd of learned Greeks.
Yeah.
And the Greeks say that they quite like little bits of Catullus and little bits of Calvus, but they think that Hortensius is rubbish, that Kina's not so good, and Memmius, I think, is rude or rudis.
I thought it was Dura.
Maybe Dura?
Yeah, which amounts to the same thing, it's just pretty sort of chugging, hard going. It's a slog.
Yeah.
You're exactly right, and that is one of the snapshots we have. Do you know when that was dated to? Obviously, we know the date of Gellius, but is Gellius reporting someone else's report?
No, I think
or
he
was
is
he
saying
with
he
Greeks?
was at the birthday party, and I think it's at the birthday party of an equestrian called Antonius Julianus.
Okay, that's great. So that at least means we've got to deal with the fact that someone in a largely Greek literary setting is able to read Memmius's poetry 2 centuries and more after the time, which really does have to mean that some people thought it worth keeping going and copying and sharing, but it was an acquired taste. It's hard to square with the Argutus and the Verbis Dulcis in terms of prose, but thank you for reminding me of that. So Memmius, not only an explicit erotic poet, but one that's a bit hard-going when it comes to evening recitals. Yes?
Thank you so much. Just a question on prosopography.
Okay.
So there's a letter written by Cicero to Atticus in February 49, that's 724, in
Okay.
which he says that a Lucretius, familiaris of Cassius, has brought news to Cassius that Nigidius Fignus, the philosopher, just
Interesting.
in Cap 1.
Okay.
Now, there are other Lucreti at this time.
There are.
Normally, these Lucretius is identified with a Quintus Lucretius Vespillo.
Mm-hmm.
Might have been in Illyria at the time. There's another Quintus Lucretius, who's actually in Sulmo.
Yes.
So Luciano Canfora, in his Life of Lucretius, tries to argue that this Lucretius is actually our Lucretius.
Correct.
And he's in Campania, he's familiaris of Cassius. I wonder what you make of that piece of evidence.
Yes, well, thank you for that very learned and interesting contribution. It's quite true that if you search for just the name Lucretius, you will find figures with that name. You'll find them in Caesar, in the letters of Cicero, scattered around here and there in the epigraphic record. But the figures that we're alluding to here generally have a much better account, a more coherent account of their own lives and progress than we have for our Lucretius. even if you disregard any of the evidence which really does seem to be pushing towards a death in the mid to late 50s BC, it still remains difficult to square these figures with Lucretius. There's been a few attempts to make the Vespillo character link, Canphora being probably the most recent, but they don't really have strong evidence beyond the fact that he is mentioned by Cicero and still alive. So it's one of those cases where we can't close the book on Lucretius's life in the mid-50s with certainty, because even the poem's incompletion could be down to his abandoning it, need not be his death. So I'm afraid, although I've gone down some of the rabbit holes which suggest these Lucretii may be relevant, I don't see any cogent evidence to unite a relatively common nomen gentilicium with our Titus Lucretius Carus, which must be ancient. But maybe we can talk after all correspond. That would be really interesting. Okay, yes.
Thank you for the impressively exhaustive lecture.
Well, exhausting.
I just want to ask one very specific thing which I didn't quite, well, it didn't come up.
Okay, sure.
It was a bit of a fringe theory anyway. I want to hear your
Fringe
opinion.
theories have their space.
There's this association with a phrase in Catullus, Aeter nox sanctae foedus amicitiae, the foedus of Aeterna amicitia, which is the same sort of language of philia with the Epicureans. And there's been this suggestion that maybe Catullus was actually part of the same Epicurean circle, in which maybe he also met Lesbia on the fringes.
Yeah. So there's two things in what you say there. The first is that both Catullus and Lucretius, who are definitely contemporaries, no one is disputing that, and who clearly interacted with some literary communal knowledge because of the evidence which you can find in poem 64 in particular of Catullus, both have a fascination with introducing legal language of the political world, into the language of human relations, emotions, friendship. We find it in both, and it's really striking in Catullus. A lot's been written on it, but it is something of a mystery how and why that emerges. Some people have tried to make an Epicurean of Catullus. I don't find it very successful myself. I think you've really got to disregard the great majority of what he writes and apparently thinks, if that's your plan. But you're quite right that by the late 60s, early 50s, Epicureanism is on the rise socially. And although I didn't have time to go into it here, Philodemus, the great Greek Epicurean, is based down in Naples because he is being hosted in the great villa of Calpurnius Piso, who himself is father-in-law of Julius Caesar. Caesar, as a younger man, seems to have been pro-Epicurean. And so we've got very high circles taking Epicureanism seriously. So it seems to me perfectly credible that Catullus could have known Epicureans in those social circles, and that he could have known Lucretius as an Epicurean, and their language of the friendship of the Epicurean circle somehow influences his poetry, albeit not philosophically. So I think there is something there, albeit not doctrinal.
I think at that point, if I may call proceedings to a halt, there are drinks and crisps outside. Please do join us. Those of you who are going to dine later, please get to Jesus by 6:45. But thank you again very much, David, for a marvellous.